La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 5, Unmasking Imperialism, Debunking Mainstream Media Propaganda and Nonsense, and imperialist war-waging content against our countries, our people, Latin America and the Caribbean, and all over the world. Unmasking Imperialism, episode 5, the media war against Venezuela. The media war continues against our sisters and brothers in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, a revolutionary people fighting against the empire, fighting against the Yankees. We're going to be debunking and dissecting some of the worst propaganda from this horrible, atrocious person named Joanna Houseman, who our comrades here also have a hatred of as well. So we're going to be debunking some of her stuff that's just really disgusting. And she's one of the people who has been out there and most vocal in favor of regime change, not only just opposing Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution, but actively calling for war, actively calling for regime change operations. And joining us today is compañera Aminta, is a Nicaraguan-American sociologist based out of New Orleans, Louisiana. Shout out to Nola. She currently researches transnational Central American identity, imperialism in the Americas, and different modes of social struggle and labor organizing. I had a good chance of chilling with her in Nicaragua. Shout out to our sisters and brothers in Nicaragua, Sandinista. How's it going, Aminta?
I'm doing very good. Excited to be back on your program and really just ready to debunk all of this imperialist media against Venezuela. So it's good to be here with both of y'all.
That's what's up. And me and Kayla were kind of making fun of Aminta a little bit. She looked like she's about to run a Fortune 500 company. But that's what's up. That's how revolutionaries should be looking like. I'm tired of this postmodern idea that we have to be all sloppy. And myself, I'm a sloppy dude, but we gotta, clean it up a little bit, be professional revolutionaries like compañera Aminta. And of course, Kayla Popuchet, a Peruvian-Haitian student, worker, and organizer based in New York City. Did I pronounce your last name right, Kayla?
Popuchet, yeah, that's good. That's good.
That's what's up. How's it going in New York?
It's a beautiful day, a little windy. Unfortunately, that rodent conniving Vendepatria that we're going to be talking about is also in this city. So gotta take away her stank breath. But I'm glad that we're talking about this and that we're not going to forget the ongoing war that the state that we live in and the actors in this country go to attack Venezuela, attack Venezuelan sovereignty. And, we're going to come to see how really deep down disgusting that it is. Yeah, definitely. I bet she probably lives in like Bed-Stuy, or not even in Bed-Stuy, in Williamsburg, which is like the most gentrified place, and probably drinks $12 soy lattes and goes to postmodern art shows and considers herself some sort of hipster revolutionary activist. But we're going to go into Joanna Houseman in a bit. Before we go into hearing some of the clips from Joanna Houseman that I want to review, and we're reviewing this because here's the thing, right? Like, Venezuela right now is not as much in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism
as it was maybe a year or two ago. That's not to say the attacks aren't still going on. They 100% are, the economic warfare, the media warfare. But every few years or so, the empire and the monster, the beast, shifts its gaze and looks at another target. This year it may be Nicaragua, the next year Iran, the next year Venezuela, China. So it's important to, at times like this, when the news cycle is a little slower on Venezuela, it's important to kind of like take a step back to review what has already been put out about Venezuela. And I want to show you an article that came out, I think, yesterday, that really caught my attention. And it's something that was not really in a lot of mainstream media. It was kind of hidden from coverage, but it's very important to analyze. This is from Al Jazeera. And yes, Al Jazeera is mainstream media, although a lot of some people on the left claim that it's progressive. It's, funded by Qatar and like the Gulf monarchies. So I would consider it mainstream media. And this is a really interesting article published by Al Jazeera: U.S. aid to Venezuela driven by more than just need, according to a report. And this is what we've been saying for years. Kayla has been saying this for years. Aminta has been saying this for years. We've all been saying this for years. All those of us in the anti-imperialist spaces and movements have been saying this for years, that the 2019 attempt to bring aid. You guys remember that in 2019, when Donald Trump was president, along the border of Colombia and Venezuela, they held a concert on the Colombia side where they had all these artists come, these whack-ass reggaeton artists who are trash, and coming out and performing and slandering Maduro, slandering the Venezuelan government. And then they were raising money for aid, and then they had this USAID truck set up to drive from the bridge from Colombia to Venezuela to deliver quote-unquote aid. And then eventually they claimed, the US government claimed that Chavistas burned it, that the Venezuela side burned the aid, and they tried to use that as like a Trojan horse technique to bring aid and kick off a regime change operation. And it's funny because when all of that was going on, like the three of us and others who were connected with, like, we were like, yo, this is obviously regime change. This is a false flag attack. This is a way to bait somebody in, a Trojan horse, so that they can launch the new war and offensive against Venezuela. Of course, people were like, oh my God, you're a conspiracy theorist. You're crazy. You're insane. The US would never do that. And here it is 2 years later. They admit it, and they said it on the low, very background, like we're distracted by all this other nonsense of Biden's whack-ass speech the other day, all this crazy news, that's meant to distract us. And this comes out, and this is important, right? This doesn't just affect Venezuela. This affects all people around the world and people in the US. This is a testament to the fact that the US does plot regime change operations. You're not crazy if you believe that the US carries out false flag attacks or bait and switch operations. And so I just want to read a little bit from this article and get responses from Aminta and Kayla. It was billed as the beginning of the end for Nicolás Maduro. With foreign leaders in tow and the world watching, anti-Maduro activists gathered in Colombia in February 2019 with the aim of pushing entire warehouses worth of aid, flown in on U.S. military cargo planes across the border into Venezuela. Instead, the humanitarian convoy was violently blocked by security forces loyal to Maduro, the first in a series of miscalculations in the Trump administration's policy towards Venezuela. More than 2 years later, the risky gambit is being questioned by a U.S. government watchdog, according to a new report by the Inspector General at the U.S. Agency for International Development. This is coming, again, straight from the horse's mouth. USAID, the number one exporter of regime change, imperialist color revolutions around the world. The new report raises doubts about whether the deployment of aid was driven more by the U.S. pursuit of regime change than by technical analysis of needs and the best ways to help struggling Venezuelans, which we know the U.S. cares so much about. The findings were published April 16th, but have not been previously reported. The report focuses on the frenzied few months after opposition leader Juan Guaido rose up to challenge Maduro's role, quickly winning recognition as Venezuela's rightful leader by the U.S. and dozens of allies. As part of that effort, USAID between January and April 2019 spent $2 million to position 368 tons of emergency supplies on the Caribbean island of Curacao and on the Colombia-Venezuela border. Under Guaido's orders, the aid was supposed to be delivered into Venezuela in defiance of Maduro, who condemned the effort as a veiled coup attempt, which is what we were saying. And I remember when mainstream media was like, Maduro raises conspiracy theories. He says that this aid attempt is a coup, and here it is, them saying it themselves, right? But when an opposition organized caravan that tried to enter Venezuela was blocked at the border, at least one truck caught fire, destroying 34,000 worth of U.S. supplied aid. The 34-page report said the U.S. deployment of aid responded in part to the Trump administration's campaign to pressure Maduro rather than just coming to the aid of struggling Venezuelans. For example, the assistance was needlessly delivered in giant Air Force C-17 cargo planes instead of cheaper commercial options that were available, the report said. Ready-to-use meals to fight child malnutrition were also sent through, even though USAID's own experts had decided the nutritional status of Venezuelan children did not warrant their use at the time. So they're saying right here, like, it's not that there's this huge starvation crisis and hunger crisis. The USAID's own experts are saying that there was no malnutrition crisis and they were creating all this stuff anyways. So that's pretty much it. There's also this ad by The Habit, which is making me mad hungry for burgers right now. But that's a whole nother conversation. But I found that to be a really interesting article because, again, right, this is confirming what we already have been saying since 2019, since it happened, that Maduro was saying that this was a coup attempt. This wasn't aid. This wasn't a humanitarian mission to bring aid. This is something that was obviously a regime change plot. And so it's just really, disgusting to see that. It's really disgusting to see how now mainstream media is putting it out there, but nobody's going to read this. That's the crazy part, is that nobody's going to read that. The record is already put down in history as Maduro is a crazy conspiracy theorist and the U.S. was trying to bring aid, even though they admit it here themselves. And that's part of the psychological operation, the hybrid war, the media war against Venezuela, is like showing highlighting what stories you get to see and don't see. So before we get to some reaction from comrades Aminta and Kayla, shout out to Comrade Yamir, saludos camaradas, los escuálidos no pudieron ni podrán con la revolución bolivariana, camarada Cero. That's what's up, Yamir. He's camarada Cero, somebody who regularly on this podcast as well. So shout out to him. And so, Aminta, what you think of this article?
I feel like it's incredibly demonstrative of the ways in which U.S. regime change really aims to manipulate the media, surrounding, like, this is how we're going to supposedly bring aid. But then I think it's important for us to also bring into the discussion of how U.S. sanctions have really strangled the Venezuelan economy, and how, if we're going to talk about crisis, we need to really pay a lot of attention as to how the U.S. government has imposed sanctions on some of Venezuela's biggest industries that are necessary for the stimulation and growth of its economy. One example that comes to mind is the immense sanctions on Petrocaribe. Petrocaribe allowed for Venezuela to provide oil, crude oil, to other Latin American nations, including also countries in the Caribbean. For instance, they had the program with Cuba where they received free oil in exchange for medical services. You have these very these networks that are focused a lot on solidarity and really focusing on mutual aid. And with the heavy sanctions that the U.S. has implemented, it's made it difficult for varying countries. It doesn't just impact Venezuela; it impacts other countries around Latin America and the Caribbean, having access to that. Also thinking about just like how petroleum in general has been sanctioned, how gold mining has also been sanctioned, and those have incredibly detrimental impacts on the living conditions of Venezuelans. So it really demonstrates that the U.S. government, alongside with organizations such as the OAS or any other countries that are aligned with imperialist projects and nations, they don't actually care about the well-being of the people who live there. They are interested in reintroducing mass privatization of the economy, something that, for example, Joanna Houseman and her entire family have made a fortune off of, and they've made that money off of the exploitation of working class Venezolanos. They've made that money off of the expropriation of natural resources and land. And so, I really think that we really need to continue in countering so much of the imperialist media. And like you mentioned before, even if somebody will call you a conspiracy theorist, the CIA regime change playbook, once they go with one program, they kind of seem to follow the same steps. So it's important for us to be really keen and also really note the ways in which U.S. foreign policy aims to undermine democratic processes and aims to really manipulate its own working class here in the States, here at home, so that we don't foster solidarity with countries like Venezuela, even though we are fighting against the same enemy and we have the same goals in mind.
Yeah, it's a great point about the importance of debunking the media propaganda. Media is such an important role in imperialist warfare and maneuvering against anti-imperialist governments. I think compared to maybe 40 or 50 years ago, it's so much more important combating the imperialist narrative. Kayla, what'd you think about this article?
So I'm gonna bring it back a little bit because it's just giving me so many reminiscent feelings of, if you remember in 2018 when the United States and the media was kicking its campaign against Nicaragua with the SOS Nicaragua stuff, and all the Marxist-Leninists, all the anti-imperialists were saying the same thing. This is an imperialist ploy to undermine the socialist process in Nicaragua.
Right.
And everyone was just like, oh my gosh, how could you say that? Look at these Nicaraguans, fighting, and you just don't care because all you care is about socialism. And it turned out to be true. It turned out that there were imperialist forces and right-wing forces within the country that were just trying to undermine the socialist process, bring down the democratically elected socialist state, which is, even looking now in their upcoming election, they are projected to win again with the popular support of the people. It's a reminiscent feeling. We had said this before in 2019 when they tried to assassinate Nicolas Maduro, when they, tried to send in this aid, and you had Lele Pons and you had Shakira, Maluma, all these Colombians who are silent about their own country, massacring FARC members, massacring environmentalists, indigenous people, social activists, silent on that. But when it comes to Venezuela, suddenly they're all fired up and ready to go to perform for a concert. You have all these people, then you have Juan Guaido getting somehow recognized by the international world, international community, which we know means the West. All this happens, and we have been holding the same line once and true, and continues to be true, that this is all an imperialist effort to undermine democratically elected governments in Latin America so that the foreign corporations, the transnational corporations, and the comprador bourgeoisie can once again regain power. It held true in 2002 when they tried to coup Hugo Chavez, and the people and the military brought him back. It held true then, as it holds true in 2019, but they put Juan Guaido in, and he looks like an international clown, and everyone in Venezuela and outside of the world knows it, but they're a little bit too embarrassed to admit it. We know this to be true. And so when you come and you see this article that, as Fidel Castro says it best, history has absolved me, or history will absolve me, I see this, and it's like, I know that, but again, when I say this, I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I'm going to sound like a clown, like, oh, the United States is pulling all the strings, but they say it so themselves. And so I'm glad that, we're having this conversation to talk about this, because as Aminta was talking about earlier, Venezuela has been in the gunslings of the empire for, since they, voted for Hugo Chavez and took back their country and made Venezuela for Venezuelans and not for the bourgeoisie, not for the foreigners, the foreign imperialists. When they took back their country, they've been the target. And you often hear a lot, especially from, Venezuelan right-wingers in the United States, or, whoever, these really carefully crafted lies, like, oh, okay, the sanctions, which have costed Venezuela $1 billion and 40,000 lives, 40,000 Venezuelans, and that was just in 2019. 40,000 Venezuelans that have died because of the sanctions. $1 billion lost from Venezuela because of the sanctions. $1 billion in gold that is still held in England that belongs to Venezuela because of the sanctions. They're unable to trade and interact like a normal country because of the sanctions. And so this aid, oh, we want to help Venezuela because they're so poor. Well, the best way to help them is by dropping the sanctions. Okay. So you often hear these carefully crafted lies like, well, the sanctions didn't start until 2017. As if the United States did not manufacture and set up a coup in 2002 against Hugo Chavez. As if the year after Hugo Chavez died in 2014, that Saudi Arabia and the United States did not carefully and politically manufacture and change the oil prices, which, Hugo Chavez was saying throughout his entire time. We need to diversify Venezuela's economy. We need to boost the agriculture industry. We need to, develop and become more sovereign so that we don't have to rely solely on oil. And then now they say in 2021, well, Venezuela is so poor because they're just socialists. And then you talk about the oils and the oil manipulation. Well, they shouldn't have based their entire economy on oil. They were not. They were trying to develop themselves out of that. You know what had happened years before when Venezuela discovered its oil? It only relied on oil. It did not develop any other industry. And when Hugo Chavez and the Chavistas succeeded the government, they succeeded a government that was completely ignoring the rest of the sectors of the country and only focused on the oil. The oil industry was powerful. The lobby was powerful, but everything else in Venezuela was nothing. They were beginning a process to develop and transform their country, but they were constantly under attack, under the gunslings, under the boot of the empire. And people continue to, repeat these lies. And I think that I'm glad, I have a couple of other folks here too, but, there's many other socialists and other people in solidarity, anti-imperialists, that need to confront these lies and show them for what they really are. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's very well-meaning people in the world who are genuinely like, oh, Venezuelans are starving. Oh, they're eating out of trash cans. That's so horrible. And they care, and they fall into this imperialist narrative because let's switch the conversation. Washington Post and CNN, they specifically say Venezuelans are dying because of socialism, so we need to go and we need to free them and we need to support Juan Guaido. Now, imagine we told the truth of what it was and how many, people around the world would support that. Well, Venezuelans are under the boot of our military and our economy, and we want to change their government so that we can continue to steal their oil and make sure that Venezuelans are in poverty. Like over 54% of Venezuelans were in poverty before Chavez took over, before they elected Chavez. And you know who was responsible for that? You know who was the financial advisor to the Venezuelan president? That was literally the reason why the Caracazo happened, was literally the reason why the Bolivarian Revolution happened. Joanna Houseman's father. His failed policies, his failed neoliberal policies are the reason why socialism exists in Venezuela now. So if they got a problem with the Chavistas, they can need to look withinwards because they're the ones that continue to try to suck Venezuelans dry, and then they claim to be patriots in the United States, living in these $1 million apartments, going to Harvard, working for all the top institutions in the world, and sitting from their ivory tower saying, those stupid Chavistas don't know what's good for them. We need to take back the country.
Yeah.
Out of here.
Dude, that would be a funny ass comedy sketch, like the people in the ivory towers talking shit about the Chavistas as if they were out in the streets doing the work. Shout out to Nelson Galvan. Hi, Ramiro. I enjoyed your interview with Caleb on the topic of Nicaragua. Yeah, me and Aminta just came back from Nicaragua. I'm currently working on a documentary about Nicaragua, about sanctions. So hopefully that'll come out soon. I've been busting my ass on it. We'll see. Hopefully it comes out okay. But it's connected to what we're talking about with Venezuela as well, because it's the same operation. There's copy and paste. Just the same tactic of trying to brand Ortega as a dictator, the same way that they do with Maduro, even though they were part of revolutions that were the result of neoliberalism, of imperialism, of capitalism. And you mentioned the key word, Kayla, Houseman, Joanna Houseman and her father, who play a big role not only in sabotaging the economy of Venezuela and implementing neoliberalism through their banking schemes and their imperialist sabotage, but also through media and propaganda. So I want to play a clip from Joanna Houseman from the New York Times, where she's openly she's claiming to debunk the the sanctions argument that we're saying that the economy of Venezuela has been hurt because of sanctions, and she tries to debunk it, but she's also calling for regime change. So I just want to play a clip from that and hear your feedback.
This movement on the American left against any U.S. involvement in Venezuela is gaining traction. We've got Noam Chomsky, Roger Waters, Oliver Stone, Boots Riley, Ilhan Omar, AOC, Jill Stein, and Bernie.
Why have you stopped short of calling Maduro of Venezuela a dictator?
Well,
and of course, we've got this lovely guy.
Donald Trump, hands up Venezuela.
It is not a good look when your slogan is co-opted by a tyrannical dictator. Now, Trump usually loves authoritarians, but this time it seems like it's the liberals who are siding with one. Now, I am not a pro-Trump military hawk. For reference, my spirit animal is Ruth Bader Ginsburg in workout clothes. But this movement is dangerously glorifying a brutal dictator and promoting inaction. And that is the worst combination for ordinary Venezuelans. First off, if you look closely at these protests, it's very unlikely you'll bump into, an actual Venezuelan.
where are you from? Where am I from? Yeah. Here. Where are you from? Philadelphia. Where are you from? No comment.
Trust me, if this was an actual Venezuelan protest, it might look more like this.
So there's this fucking idiot, Joanna Houseman, comedian, imperialist, sabotager, banker. Her family, her dad is Ricardo Houseman, a banker who creates no value, by the way. I think bankers should be locked up. They're some of the biggest criminals. They don't produce value. What the fuck do bankers make? They just move money around magic squares and numbers out of corporate buildings. They're not, making food for people. They're not helping society in any way. And so it's just another example of the propaganda that's put out there. And again, this is somebody who's not even ethnically represent the majority of Venezuelans, black and brown, a nation like Venezuela, who's saying like, oh, well, they're not even actually Venezuelan. So Aminta, let's start off with you. What's your, as somebody who has dealt with this as well from Nicaragua, right? Because you're Nicaraguan, and there's people who say, talk shit about Nicaragua who are like, oh, well, as a Nicaraguan, I feel this and that. How do you feel about that use of like that liberal approach to imperialism where they say, oh, well, I'm this nationality, so only I can talk about this, and just your thoughts on that video.
I think that we really need to be strategic in the ways that we call out this gross liberalization of identity politics, not only because it is manipulated to push out imperialist regime change, but also it blatantly and violently ignores the surrounding narratives of many working class Black and brown Venezolanos, as well as, I like to talk a little bit and write a little bit about what it means to partake in a transnational identity and the complexities that holds. And I think that those are meaningful discussions. However, it is absolutely pointless if we do not talk about identity without also analyzing and observing the ways in which international political economies have been manipulated, undermined by the West, by the imperialist West, with its attempts to subvert democratic processes. And she wants to talk about, oh, I'm so Venezuelan, this and that. From my understanding, she was born in Britain, has not really lived most of her life in Venezuela by any means. And I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more, but her family, both her mom, her dad, even her maternal grandfather, have engaged in, I want to almost use the word like demonic forms of repression against working class Latin Americans and Venezuelans. I mean, I just think that we need to really understand that we can't just fall in the trap of just thinking about identity and stopping it there. We really need to understand, okay, like kind of asking almost abstractly, what does it mean to have a certain identity? What does that mean in terms of your class positionality, your mobility in certain different spaces? And how does that impact your political engagement? For somebody like Joanna Houseman, her engagement is one that will protect and serve the interests of the comprador bourgeoisie. It is going to serve the interest of her being able to live in a luxury apartment in New York City. Like we mentioned before, Ricardo, he is a professor at the JFK School of Government at Harvard. Her mom, Ana Julia Jatar, has a position in Sumate, which is a right-wing group funded by the neoconservative National Endowment for Democracy. Even her grandfather, Braulio Jatar Dotti, was described by an independent Chilean news site as having been in charge of eliminating leftist groups in Venezuela in the 1960s. And he even published a manual in 1963 called Disabling the Extreme Left. So this is why I think we really need to combat liberalism, because Joanna Houseman isn't trying to come off. She said it herself. She's like, I'm not a war hawk. I'm just a liberal. I love Ruth Bader Ginsburg and, this and that, really trying to appease, kind of in the same, aesthetically a little different. I think there are nuances, but in a similar way to how sites like Vice will try to manipulate the narrative surrounding what is actually happening in Latin America. What do different social movements look like, especially those that are inherently revolutionary and are trying to create a new paradigm, a paradigm that is building revolutionary socialism, and that is aiming to fight for self-determination and sovereignty. But they conflate it, and she's just really appealing to this liberal narrative, oh, she's not like Donald Trump. But I mean, I would say ideologically she is like Donald Trump, because her family and herself in particular are their entire economic policies are incredibly anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. They're anti-worker. Right off the bat, you cannot tell me or talk to me about human rights abuses or dictatorships when your own family is so deeply intertwined with trying to establish regime change and even creating crisis in the 90s when her dad was basically the right-hand man for the former president, right? So, and I mean, her dad right now too, from 1994 to 2000, he worked as the head economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. Like that's, I mean, we know the ways in which the World Bank and the OAS and all of these different institutions aim to ensure that there is a labor reserve in Latin America that can be exploited, that the land can be expropriated, all just to increase the thickness of the wallets of the rich ruling class. And I mean, there's just so much harm that the IDB has enacted, and you can really even argue, that Houseman, both just Joanna as an individual, but the entire family, the extent of harm that they've reproduced expands even outside of Venezuela. I mean, the IDB has human rights abuses in Colombia, neighboring Colombia, under their right-wing government, and how they're financing the Itahuango hydroelectric project that, has led in the repression and assassination of indigenous people who are combating the expropriation of their land. We see this too in Guatemala. So Houseman is enacting harm in that respect too. And just to end off on this point, that, it doesn't matter what her identity is, because at the end of the day, the ideas that she is promoting also end up hurting the working class in the United States. Ambos, as well as, the Latin American diaspora community in the US, but also all working class people in the US. Her politics, her analysis are so incredibly detrimental. And this is why we have to have solidarity. So shame on her for, and I think it's very strategic how they wanted to just say, they only showed 3 white guys for the people who were at the Hands Off Venezuela protest. And I can tell you, when I was in the embassy in Washington, D.C. for 2 weeks, and, even further on, when I was outside of the embassy too, it is an incredibly diverse amount of people that make up and compose the anti-imperialist movement. It is multi-generational, multiracial. And that is crucial to note. So they try to really frame it as, oh, it's just a sector of the radical left that is just white, middle class, whatever. But that's not true. And it just makes me so angry because just on a brief reflection, like when I was at the embassy, it was these same right-wing Venezuelans, that are pushing for imperialist regime change, that are pushing for anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-women policies, where I also myself, I heard the most racist things in my life directed to me, like, ever. So that really just informs you of their politics. So, when we're analyzing this, I urge, for people to, if they haven't already adopted this, but even just sharing this with our communities, like, our perspectives and analyses need to be internationalist. We need to really have a strong anti-imperialist perspective because it will strengthen our movements here in the United States. And so those are my thoughts. Those were kind of a lot of thoughts, but that's kind of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good point, and it's a good way to frame the economic warfare against Venezuela, because that's exactly what it is. I mean, when we talk about since 1999, after which I was elected president of Venezuela, since the early 2000s, you have the case of supermarket owners affiliated with Venezuela's opposition who've been purposely hoarding food products so that they can resell them at higher rates and make large profits. You have cash hoarding, them sending money to other countries to hoard it, to devalue the currency. One thing that's interesting is that in 2013, former Venezuelan central bank chief Ed Bentancur reported the country lost between 15 and $20 billion the previous year through fraudulent import deals that were done by the opposition. Because let's remember, even though Venezuela is in the process of building socialism, there's still a private sector that is controlled by the opposition. There's still a sector of the bourgeoisie, and they're able to use economic warfare to leverage power against the socialist government. 2016, you have over 750 opposition-controlled offshore companies linked to the Panama Papers scandal, which was never covered, never talked about the fact that the opposition was hoarding all this money and cash in Panama that was stolen from Venezuela. And that's not even talking about all of the overseas assets that were taken from Venezuela, the gold bars in the UK, in New York, the Federal Reserve Bank, billions of dollars stolen overnight. And so it's just, this is an example of the kind of the dual economic and media warfare that's waged against Venezuela. But Kayla, what'd you think about Joanna's clip?
Well, I mean, I got hot. I got pissed off because every time, Aminta's right on the nose when you say it. Like, they opportunistically went up to very clearly white American people and asked them, "Where are you from?" You don't. They're not going to go up to somebody. You come to New York City and you see a pro-Venezuelan rally. I see Caribbeans, majority Caribbean people. I don't like. You got your little older white Trotskyites. You see majority Dominicans, some Venezuelans, Puerto Ricans, but that's the makeup of New York City. But they opportunistically go up to all the white people and be like, "Oh, where are you from?" As if they can't be in solidarity with Venezuela against them. And that's another thing to take note of too, is that, all right, well, Joanna Houseman wants to call herself Venezuelan. Whatever, you're Venezuelan. You got your Venezuelan passport. You got your Venezuelan accent. Okay, you're Venezuelan. But do you represent the masses of Venezuela? No, you are a rich woman. I'm not going to use the slurs right now, but you are a rich woman with millions of dollars. Your family has institutional power in Venezuela. They themselves, as Aminta had pointed out extensively, come from a very, very imperialist comprador class that has a vested interest in destroying all liberation movements throughout Latin America and their countries of origin. You are not the representative of Venezuelan people. You are a rich Venezuelan white girl with a mic, and you have a mic because you're a rich Venezuelan white girl. That's the obvious truth. I mean, there's a comparative difference. It's I've met white Venezuelans who, surprised me. And even in New York City, I've met white Venezuelans who will like come up, and I have a Venezuelan, hands up Venezuela button, and they come up and they say thank you. I have a really great comrade who actually self-deported last year, white Venezuelan guy, blue eyes and everything, grew up just a few blocks away from Chavez. And I mean, that's the homie. Like, he is a huge Chavista, but it's because of their class. Right? Joanna Houseman is a rich white woman of the elite class, whereas these Venezuelans that I met that were cool and that they were pro liberation of Venezuela come from the slums. They come from the working class. They know what it's like to grow up, under the boot of the empire and the boot of capitalism and the comprador class, and so they stand against it. You will never catch. I have my comrades in Red Afro Venezolano. They live in Barlovento, which is on the coast of the Venezuelan Caribbean. And when I try to have my video conferences with them, we have to like do it 5-10 times in like maybe a half hour. And they constantly say the same thing. Sorry, it's because of the sanctions, our internet is rough. Sorry, it's because of the sanctions, our internet is rough. But that never stops their militancy, because they understand exactly the class contradictions of what's at play. They understand the international contradictions at what's at play. And what Joanna Houseman does, and what these rich Venezuelans that live in the United States, that live in Texas with the oil industry, that live in Washington, D.C., lobbying for regime change, they understand the political complexities too, but they're misleading you. They're manipulating you. They're trying to pull on the strings. Well, I'm Venezuelan, so hear me roar. What is your class character? What is your class analysis? It's just as clear as day. And so, as Aminta said, it's a really pure liberalization of identity politics, where you take this identity and say, well, therefore I become the sole speaker. And here's the thing: you will find brown Venezuelans or mestizo Venezuelans, black Venezuelans in New York City, throughout the country, who will all say the same thing. But again, what is your class character? Do you have a vested interest in overthrowing imperialism or maintaining it? And that is the biggest difference. And so I just wanted to, just shout out this book that we're talking about, for people that want to know more about Venezuela, learn more about the sanctions, learn more about the history. This is by Claudia de la Cruz, Manolo de los Santos, and Vijay Prashad. Viviremos: Venezuela versus the Hybrid War. It's a really good educational book about, one, how the sanctions are illegal. They're a violation of international law, which just goes to show that the empire does not care what it does, because it has no one to listen to. It is the West is the ruling class of the world. It pays no attention to what the rest of the world says. So it does whatever it's want. But it also talks about this history of the sanctions, the history of Venezuela, the Caracazo, which was a really deadly uprising, deadly because of people like Joanna Houseman and everything that she represents. And I just want to say, not to be like petty or anything, but this woman is so corny. I mean, so corny. I constantly say this: you're liberals abroad, but fascists at home. Oh, Ruth Gator Ginsburg is my spirit animal. Who gave this woman a mic? When I tell you she has a mic because she's a rich white Venezuelan, I meant that. Huh? She's not like,
Yeah.
you're telling me this is a comedian? You're telling me she's a professor at the New School? With what credentials other than being a rich white Venezuelan that does the work of the empire? And so, we could talk about her family, and it's not to say that, everyone is going to be responsible for the crimes of their family. My mom, my family members are not political. They have a lot of trauma as to, when they left Peru and stuff. So they don't really talk about politics, and they just don't care. Obviously, I'm not like that. We're not like the sole representatives of our families. However, the difference with and I mentioned this because Ricardo Houseman has said, my daughter is not me, but my daughter's opinions are not just because of me. She's an independent woman with her own mind. Okay, she could be an independent woman with her own mind. But the work that she does and the work that she says is actually not that independent at all. It is very consistent, in line with the crimes of her family and what they've continued to do, what they've done up to her grandfathers have done to her parents. So yeah, she is not, just who she is because of her father. She's who she is because of her class. She's who she is because she continues to be what her family and everything that her family represents. She continues to be that. She continues to uphold that. So that is one of the biggest problems with Joanna Houseman, other than the fact that she is, quite literally an imperialist warmonger. What is let's get back to the premise of that video. What exactly were you trying to say there, Joanna Houseman? The United States should be involved in Venezuela? That we should be, getting aggressive and add more military aggression? Is that what you're saying? Because her whole complaint was leftists not saying, the leftists here were just saying, hands off Venezuela, US, leave Venezuela alone, stop trying to do regime change. And she says, no, that's bad. Then what are you trying to get at? What are you saying is good? What is your answer? Riddle me that.
She wants blood on the streets, and the banking institutions that she's connected to, they profit from that, from chaos, from crisis. We're in an era of imperialism, as Lenin mentioned, where there's accumulation through destruction. The imperialists don't want stability of any kind around the world that isn't connected to their financial institutions. They profit from chaos. That's why the U.S. has funded permanent wars across the Middle East and Syria, and Latin America, and the Caribbean. They want a state of chaos and crisis so that they can control people, keep people destabilized, oppressed. And it's really a shame to see how she is propagating that. And it's really interesting. I think I've been rereading Marx Capital by Karl Marx, just going back to the basics, right? Because there's so much talk on the left about identity politics and stuff. And I obviously have a strong critique of identity politics from a Marxist perspective. And one of the things that Marx talks about a lot in Capital is the ability for the capitalists and the imperialists to flip. It's kind of like this demonic way of making you seem like the bad guy, even though they're the ones that are doing evil. So, for example, like, it's interesting because it was interesting. You mentioned, Aminta, about the racial and class nature of the Embassy Protection Collective that happened a few years ago that you took part in, because Joanna Houseman, let's take somebody like Joanna Houseman, for example. She's clearly a white settler. She doesn't represent the majority of Venezuelans in terms of the racial dynamic. However, she's using identity politics to oppose, to attack Black and brown people in Venezuela who support the revolution, right? So she's using an ideology that purports to be for Black and brown people to attack Black and brown people. And then Black and brown people who defend the Venezuelan revolution, the Bolivarian revolution, who don't necessarily adhere to the dogma of identity politics, they understand that you can be white and be an ally and be in solidarity with the Bolivarian revolution, and that you should have white people out there rallying in defense of Venezuela, in solidarity. And they're okay with it, right? They're not going like, oh, that's problematic, that's, whatever. And they're able to flip it, right? They're able to like use identity politics against Venezuela and make them seem like, oh, look, it's only white people that are supporting the Bolivarian revolution, when actual Black and brown people from Venezuela, that's the first thing they tell you. Not even just white people, but people in the US are like, support us. Like, we don't care who you are, if you're Chinese, Korean, like, we don't give a fuck who you are, what you are. We want solidarity. We'll take it from anybody we can, because that's a Marxist perspective, a Marxist understanding of revolutionary solidarity. And I think it's just interesting because conversely, the U.S. empire, we have, for example, Lloyd Austin, who's the Secretary of Defense in the U.S. Under Biden, and he's the one who attacked Syria. He's launching all these regime change operations around the world, trying to start a new war with Russia. And he's a Black man, but they uphold his appointment as like, oh, this is progress. Have a seat at the table. And so we have to be very careful. I remember when a lot of this ID poll stuff started kind of coming up, 2013, 2014. And I think the left kind of did a poor job of not scientifically being able to dissect and debunk it from a Marxist perspective. And I think this is a classic example. Joanna House is a classic example of these imperialist tricksters using these synthetic left ideologies against our own people to divide us. And it's like, wait a second, you're like from Germany or some shit. It's just like, so it just doesn't make sense. But before we move on, I just want to play a clip. Shout out to Camarada Cero, by the way, who recorded this clip. This is a very famous clip of Compañera Aminta. Kayla was also here as well at this event. So this is a few years back. This is actually Aminta, our very own Aminta, confronting Joanna Houseman. It was one of the most beautiful videos I saw. And I think so many of us who are communists, anti-imperialists, who have seen Joanna Houseman's videos and are like, oh, like, she's horrible. Aminta, like, I lived vicariously through Aminta, and it was very cathartic to see you confront her here. So I just want to play this clip of you just laying down the facts and steady. Look at the way Aminta confronts her. She's not like emotional. She's very calm, collect. She puts her arguments forward. So I just want to show this clip and we'll get your reactions. Let me just get us off here for a second.
I think it is disgusting that somebody like Joanna Houseman, who lives in a luxury apartment in New York City, decides what is happening in Venezuela. I went to Venezuela this summer, and I actually met with Venezuelans, and you will see that in every corner in Venezuela, in Caracas, you will see that the Bolivarian revolution continues to live within every person in Venezuela. You will see that Venezuelans are not even filled with these so-called violent individuals, but in fact, you see people who are trying to combat U.S. sanctions, foreign policy that, for example, Joanna Houseman, your father is Ricardo Houseman.
Thank you.
I like how compañero Yamir Camarada Cedo was like, yo, relax, my dude, yo, chill. And this guy was just going in. He was just going crazy. Shout out to Aminta for doing that. Not a lot of people will do that. You know, I give mad props to Aminta because, you know, we're talking about a banker princess, you know, the daughter of somebody who has literally called for coups, who has overthrown governments. Like, these aren't just regular people. These are some of the top ruling class. And for you to be able to confront her, I think was something that was really cool. Maybe let's start off with you, Comrade Kayla, because obviously Aminta was in the video, and then we'll go to Aminta afterward. But Kayla, what are your thoughts? You were there as well, so tell us like about that moment.
I mean, I just want to say how like down Aminta was about it, because I mean, I live in New York, but Aminta at the time was living in Washington, D.C. And I don't even know how I found out about the event, but I call her up like maybe the day before or like the same day. And I was like, Aminta, Joanna Houseman is having a public event in the new school. Like, we need to stop it. And she's like, bet, we're coming. And like buys a bus ticket, comes to New York. We're outside agitator. and then we go, and it was, I mean, that event, I think it was very surreal. Like, I just remember, you know, sitting down and trying to see like how many people would be there. And mostly, you know, white people, just a bunch of white people that were sitting there. And it was kind of, I don't know what exactly it was, but there was a certain point where I was like, all right, Aminta, go. Like, get up and do it. And then she just pops off, and Joanna Houseman is just sitting there like, oh, here we go again. Like, I don't know. I don't think that they expected it, because they saw the crowd of young students, people who probably don't know any much better. And Aminta was popping off. She was, you know, getting everybody hot. You saw that one guy, so disrespectful. I mean, absolutely no manners, that kid. I mean, then again,
just mad corny, yo. He's like, thank you.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, that guy pissed me. I mean, so he goes up to Aminta, then there's an older man who like walks up to her, and then, you know, Yamid goes and stops her. I get up and I'm like, all right, while they're doing this, I had a Chavista shirt on, so I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. I don't even remember what I said. The old man comes up to me and he's like, how much are they paying you? And I was like, how much are they paying you? I don't get paid for this.
Right.
How much they paying you? I mean, it got crazy. Then you got like a Chilean girl who was like started standing up and saying like, oh, you know, Chile stood up against a dictatorship or whatever, and we were just all clowning her. It got crazy. You know, at one point, like, this girl got up in my face. I pushed her. She slapped me. Like, it was let me tell you, these Latin American fascists. Oh, I threw the water bottle at because she was pissing me off. Okay, these Chileans with their white supremacy just be pissing me off. But you know, Aminta was getting at this before too, like about the character of these right-wing Venezuelans is that like they'll come to people who don't know any better and be like, you know, feign this innocence of I just want my country to be free for you to run around like it's playground, right? It's your playground. And then they turn around, and when you're actually somebody from Latin America, like Aminta I saw some of the things that they would say about her. I saw some of the campaigns that they would have against her, and they were attacking Aminta. And Aminta's only 19 years old when she's dealing with this, and she's literally got like a whole diaspora in a city against her. She's got all eyes. She's got the state looking at her. Like I don't know. I don't think I could have handled that, but she handled that like a boss, and she still came up and told Joanna Houseman about herself. But like even some of the things that I've heard, like, for example, even just on like Instagram, you'll say something about Venezuela, and then people will be like, "Oh, you're Peruvian. You have a nose of a bird." Like, I don't know. They're just like there's just so much racism. They really show their ass when you're a Latin American person, and like the way that they talk to you, they'll use these racist things. They'll call you in India. They'll call you a nigger. They'll be nasty. But then to the other side, to the liberal American, they're like, oh, free my country from the the crutches of Maduro, and we just need to be free, and we need Donald Trump to save us. And also that's a narrative that's like not popular within Venezuela. That's why the opposition, even the opposition, this type of opposition, lost a lot of support of the opposition in Venezuela, because that's not a popular saying to say, yeah, come and liberate my country within the country. But that was quite an event. Joanna Houseman immediately, I love this. We shut down the event. They were so angry. There was the Chilean girl started crying. Like we made our mark to the point that Joanna Houseman got home, went online onto Twitter, and she blocked me. Like I didn't even find me, and she blocked us both. It was hilarious.
That's fucking funny. We should have posted that shit on WorldStar and be like, yo, on the Shade Room. And that would have been hilarious. But yo, Aminta, what was going through your mind as that was happening, and tell us a little bit about how you felt at that moment.
So I remember, honestly, huge shout out and big thanks to Kayla for bringing this event to my attention, because I don't think that I would have been able to do it without her support and her camaraderie. I remember before we even were about to sit down, we were in the bathroom kind of trying to strategize, like, okay, this is how we're going to do this. And there was, I think, maybe 10, 15 minutes max where they were talking. It was normal, like a normal event. But then it got to a point where I just kind of felt the adrenaline sort of hit me. And in my mind, I was really trying to strategize, okay, how am I going to just call her out in this moment? And so as soon as I stood up, I was just like, all right, I did my research. I studied as much as I could about her family, about her involvement. I'm going to shut this down. And I remember, I think, something that really encouraged me to speak out was when they started talking about how los colectivos are just filled with gang members. Earlier that year, I was in Caracas, and I had the opportunity, I had the honor to meet with people who are building revolution in los colectivos. And it was incredible to see how it was, it's majority families. They're people who have used the constitutional reforms of even, 1999 when Hugo Chavez was elected to really like take land back and like redistribute the resources that were rightfully theirs. And so, when I just hear things like, oh, they're filled with gang members or this or that, I'm like, no, you're just being racist, first of all, because, yeah, the majority of the people in the colectivos are Afro-Venezolanos or mestizos, they're people who are working class, who have a critical consciousness about what it means to actively be fighting and resisting empire for the means of your own people's liberation, for the creation and reaffirming of your livelihood. Because I think that is fundamentally why we're socialist, right? Why we're Marxist, why we're communist, is because we recognize that our people deserve to have the wealth that is rightfully ours. We deserve to have access to, from basic human rights, just housing, healthy food, water, but also to have the possibility to cultivate community. That was something so brilliant that I saw when I was in colectivos. For those who are watching who've never had the opportunity to go to Caracas, it is a very big city. I think it's the biggest city in Latin America that I visited. And it's incredible to just see what urban popular movements and resistance look like. Because when we were in Nicaragua, we really had the opportunity to see what peasant and farm worker movements look like. And those are also critically important, and they play a huge role in Venezuela too. Unfortunately, when I was there, I didn't have the opportunity to really go into more rural farmland. I was in urban farmland, but regardless, the ways in which Venezuelans are building resistance in spite of having to deal with the weight of U.S. empire and imperialism is incredibly inspiring. I remember too, and these are just things that I was thinking of prior to speaking. We were in a theater in Caracas, beautiful performance of different musicians and artists. And at the end, they mentioned that some of us from the Embassy Protection Collective were there. And I remember this woman came up to us and she was crying and she was saying, thank you for resisting and thank you for not falling for the imperialist propaganda. And I just think of all of the different ways that people are actively resisting, young people, old people, and how esa lucha, that fight, that struggle is something that is very characteristic in various Latin American countries. So really, and all over the world, people are fighting and resisting U.S. empire. So I think that for us, it's really crucial to be courageous, which is hard. It's scary. 2019 was really frustrating and difficult for me in the sense that I did face a lot of state repression. I had Secret Service, they were stalking us. Homeland Security opened an investigation on me. I was 19. I just dropped out of college because I was sick. I was going to American University where they have the School of International Studies, but I like to call it the School of Imperialist Studies. It was just not the right environment for me, and really feeling like I wanted to take decision that meant following my heart and following the values that, I really had learned about because, I've been a Marxist since I was 16, and we all have our different, paths as to, how we've become Marxists and anti-imperialists and organizers. And in spite of that being scary, right? Like in spite of dealing with, these are the most racist people I've ever dealt with in my entire life. I had white Venezuelans who would just say shit to me like, you're so ugly, I see the indigenous in your face and your nose and your eyes, like constant stalking and harassment. Because DC, it's a big city, but it's also not a big city. And like things just got very intense very, very quickly. You Google me and there's a photo. They found a photo of me with a BB gun, and they tried saying that I was a domestic terrorist. You can so tell it's not a real gun, but that's just kind of the shit that they try to pull, right? And that's the intimidation tactics and the psyops. And I know that I wasn't the only one who had to deal with the repression. A great journalist, for folks who, if y'all don't know her already, Alina Duarte, who used to be with Telesur, she was also doing great coverage of the embassy, and she had right-wing racist Venezuelans try to break into her house. There was just so many levels. Journalists like Max Blumenthal, I remember that the State Department or Secret Service, they just showed up at his house and they arrested him and took him in a van. That was just so when we talk about state repression, cuando hablamos de una dictadura, when we're talking about a dictatorship, let's analyze what is happening here in the United States. And let's even bring it a little bit more recent. We had the protests in this past summer, how many BLM protesters were arrested. I know that some protesters were even murdered. And, there is a long-standing history of people fighting for Black liberation in the United States that have been massacred, assassinated by the State Department. So a huge fuck you to Joanna Houseman and to anybody who is working for U.S.-backed regime change, because like we've mentioned before, it's racist, it's anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-worker. You don't actually care about the well-being of people, and this is why we need to actively also combat liberalism, because the narratives are not just going to be from people like Donald Trump or John Bolton or Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, even though these same people are meeting and working alongside of people like Joanna Houseman or any other liberal talking head, but
talking demon. She looks like a goblin,
She does. She was okay. I'm not gonna be mean. I'm gonna be quiet.
I'll be mean. Escualidad de mierda.
Yeah, dude. I don't know, man. She came from the underworld, and is on a crusade to wage war. But I have mad respect for you, Aminta, for doing that. Like I said, not a lot of people will actually have, the courage to do that. And I thought that was really cool of you. And to just calmly break down that analysis that she was not able to even debunk herself, because she understands that, she knows this, and she's making money. She's, working for these imperialist institutions. And it's like Malcolm X said, right? The media is the most powerful entity on earth. It could make you think that your friends are your enemies and your enemies are your friends. And in this case, we've been convinced by mainstream media that Venezuela is our enemy, that we have to invade, that we have to overthrow the country. And it's complete nonsense. And I think somebody like Joanna Houseman is a perfect example of somebody who's promoting that sort of regime change narrative. Before we dip out, because I do have to dip out, I have my regular Friday dinner date with Ophelia, so I got to go pick her up. But Kayla, your final thoughts on the media war against Venezuela and how we can combat that?
I think, I have a particular analysis about it too, because like, one, I live in the United States. I'm in New York. I'm in the center of capital, and it is my job here, being here and being in the center of capitalism, to make sure that you're standing up for Venezuela. A lot of people on the left want to have their criticisms. They want to criticize, while they're sitting in the belly of the beast. They want to criticize what the Venezuelan government should be doing, and that's not to say that like we can't look at things analytically. But what does it serve when you're going into public spaces and you're criticizing a government that your own is engaging in a hybrid war against? You do nothing but serve the empire. So I think that it is a good job for all of us, and to have these conversations and to give information to people, for people that the people that at the People's Forum who wrote Viviremos. These are the kinds of things that we need, so that we can stand in solidarity with Venezuela, but also understand that they're fighting for their liberation. That is all what this is about. And at the same time, being a Peruvian-American or a Peruvian person who also understands how in South America, even these comprador countries, these proxy governments like the one of Lima that still has control in Lima, or in Bogota and in Chile still, how they're all the empire uses our own people to turn on our own people. But at the end of the day, it's the comprador class that has power in Colombia, not the Colombians, the comprador Colombians. It is the comprador class that has power in Lima right now. Well, that's for right now. Let's see what happens on June 6th. The right wing in Peru is always warning, Castillo is going to make us Peruzuela, turn us into that. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how there might be, one with Venezuela, and see what the updates in Peru. But I might have to turn on my own, ask a Peruvian, and be like, no, actually, ask a Peruvian. I could tell you socialism good. But I'm glad that we're having these conversations, and that we need to constantly be vigilant, even if Venezuela is not in the news right now. It will be in the news in a couple years time. The empire, as it's dying like a desperate dog, it's still trying to that's what they do. They say, right? That's a saying: a dying dog attacks, or a dying dog bites, and that's what this empire is. It's going to constantly keep biting, South America, Chile, while they're doing their constitutional assembly, Bolivia, which has regained its power, Venezuela, Cuba, every country in the world that rejects the power of the West in its own countries, which accepts that only sovereignty and socialism is the best way forward for their people. Every country like that is going to be in the gunslings of the empire. And so our job here in the United States, whether you're a diaspora or not, and if you're diaspora, talk to your people. If you're not diaspora, still talk to the people. It's our job here to stand in solidarity with those that are under the boot of our country, and also to fight for socialism within our country, because that is the best way to be an ally to Venezuela, is to make sure that you're fighting for the international working class everywhere, and especially stand in solidarity with the Venezuelan people who are fighting for their sovereignty.
Well said, Kayla. I think that's exactly the role, is to ask, what can we do in the belly of the beast? Not to be like, what is my criticism? I think that's a great point. So many people, that's one of the things that angered me a lot about Noam Chomsky, that he was like one of those people who are like, well, what we have to do is we have to analyze Venezuela from, it's like, dude, like, come on, like, now's not the time to be talking shit. Now's the time to be in defense. We have to be active. Like, that's what solidarity is about, and having trust in the Venezuelan people to support their process, support their revolution, be in solidarity, whether you have criticisms or not. Shout out to Dust. Shout out to everybody watching and listening. Aminta and Kayla, it's really dope talking to both of y'all about Venezuela. Definitely want to have y'all back on. Again, this was episode 6, actually, thanks to one of the comrades who corrected me earlier, episode 6 of Unmasking Imperialism. Aminta and Kayla, peace out. It was really dope talking with y'all, and I hope you guys have a great weekend. Peace out.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.